But before we get going, I did want to say just a tiny bit using my medical cap here as someone who's treated sleep disorders for a number of years. There are over 100, I think 108 sleep disorders now. And by far, hands down, the number one sleep disorder is, of course, insomnia, right? And there are so many different types of insomnia: short-term insomnia, chronic insomnia, sleep onset, sleep maintenance, early morning awakening insomnia, mixed insomnia, comorbid insomnia. And there are obviously a tremendous array of skillful means. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is probably the most effective one over the counter, so to speak. But I wanted to give you just a couple of general tips that may be some benefit to you from the West, and then a few probably not so well-known tips from the East. And really, this has to do with the implementation of sound sleep hygiene practices. And so very briefly, if you are struggling from sleep insomnia, and there are millions upon millions of people in America and around the world that do, here's some couple of just kind of bullet point baseline things from the West, and then a few unusual ones or different ones that we can augment from the so-called East. So no caffeine after lunch. Caffeine has a half-life of about 8 hours. So if you drink a cup of coffee at noon, you can have half of it in your system 6 to 8 hours later. No late naps. Napping is great, but if you take one after 3 or 4 o'clock, that will arrest too much of the adenosine that's building up. That's what causes us to sleep. Adenosine is like kind of a pressure molecule that builds up during the day. And we want to obviously have some of that before we go to bed, otherwise we're not going to go to bed. So if you take a nap too late in the afternoon, that will kind of clean out the adenosine and you kind of have to start over. So no late naps, plenty of sunshine, especially in the later afternoon. That helps keep the circadian rhythms back on track. Very helpful thing to do. A really helpful thing for us these days, 2 to 3 hours before you go to sleep. And this for some people takes a little bit of discipline. You want to start to pull away, almost detox from light, especially the blue light that you find in tablets, computers, because that type of light frequency has been shown to inhibit the release of melatonin, the so-called Dracula or vampire hormone that only comes out at night. If you do need to do late night work type of thing, you can get glasses now that will block that frequency out, because otherwise it will really inhibit the release of that particular hormone. You want to associate your sleep, your bedroom, I should say, with sleep and intimacy. Keep the business and other kind of distracting mechanisms out of the bedroom. It's really a way to increase your respect for the sleep condition altogether. And I'll have to say a little bit more about that in a second. You want the room to be cool, about 66 degrees. That's the sweet spot. Very often you may notice when you're really too hot, your limbs get splayed out all over just to cool off. And so cool room temperature is actually really important. Darkness, if you can't maintain really solid darkness in your room, eye muffs, you can get these really effective iPads called Mindfolds that will, I use them when I'm doing things like dark retreat in settings, in public settings. That stuff will really shut out like 99% of light. Really, really quiet, white noise if you need it. Earplugs, I use the silicone earplugs. I think they're by far the best. I have a very hyperactive reticular activating system, which means, I will wake up if there's a fly walking on the ceiling, right? I'm so hypersensitive. So I have to use all these tricks and tips, but my sleep is, I tell you, I hit the pillow within 5 minutes, I'm gone. Exercise is great, but not too late. Because if you exercise later in the afternoon or early evening, what does that do? Raises your body temperature, and that's going to keep you up. And so if you do need exercise later, maybe try to do it anaerobic, more like muscle resistance stuff versus aerobic stuff, which gets your temperature really pretty high. Food, you want to stay from eating, keep away from eating too late, because the release of those hormones and whatnot, necessary enzymes for digestion, can interfere with sleep. Alcohol will help you fall asleep. It has a rebound effect. Many of you know this, right? So generally stay away from alcohol if you can. And fundamentally, the idea is don't violate the natural curfew of the night. It's really interesting to me that starting with the advent of artificial light, we used to have what's called biphasic sleep patterns. The really super interesting set of studies were done decades ago that really discovered a kind of archaeology of consciousness. That prior to the advent of artificial light, we slept in two phases. Even Homer talked about it, the first and second sleep of the night. And so it's very common. In fact, people sometimes, when they have sleep maintenance insomnia, it could actually be a residue of this biphasic sleep kind of archaeology, where people would normally, before the advent of consolidated sleep and 8 hours consolidated block, they came about with the advent of artificial light. Interestingly, in my opinion, kind of a spiritual interjection. I would argue that that was the onset of the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age. Both in Hinduism and Buddhism, they talk about the Dark Age. And I think one of the most insidious manifestations of this Dark Age is artificial light and our addiction to it with all these weapons of mass distraction. And so you want to curtail some of those mechanisms. Don't violate the natural curfew of the night. If you do find yourself waking up 4 hours after you go to sleep, that could be a residue of what some traditions talk about as the hour of God, which when in pre-artificial light eras, people would get up for 1 to 2 hours and do contemplative work, engage in prayer and recitation and the like. And so therefore, some people who wake up and have this like almost consistent sleep maintenance insomnia, that could be due, in fact, to that, you could say, residue. There are ways to work with that I'll talk about in terms of meditation, in terms of liminality and whatnot. You can take advantage of these periods of insomnia. If you relate to it properly, as Sean was intimating, you can transform obstacle into opportunity. There are ways, and maybe I can show you one really powerful trick using a technique. I'm writing 2 books on this topic right now. I'm super big on it because there's nothing in the literature on this topic. I'm writing 2 books on a very little known set of practices called the reverse meditations that come from the deep Mahamudra tradition. I'm going to ping out a couple terms that I'm not going to define, just for maybe some of the deeper divers, and also just to give some credibility to some of the languaging that I'm using. But there's a really interesting set of practices called reverse meditations, where in fact you voluntarily bring about unwanted circumstances. It's a little bit like MBSR on steroids in a certain way, where these practices, when they're brought to some proficiency, allow you to bring any unwanted experience onto the path. And one of these, of course, is insomnia. And so doing a type of reverse meditation, Sean, maybe you can remind me, it's a very easy thing to do, very quick, will help you establish a new relationship to the mind that goes a little bit crazy in the middle of the night. Very simple reverse meditation can help you there. But the idea is to honor and respect the way you sleep and dream. It's incredibly interesting to me, prior to the Dark Ages, literally in this case, the historical Dark Ages. Prior to that time, the archetype I use is the healing temples of Asclepius. This is a Greek god, the physician of healing. In a very interesting way, when people wanted to receive a dream from the divine physician, they would enter these healing temples in Greece. They would go through a host of ritual purification practices, meditation, cleansing, as a way to create an environment, a milieu, an atmosphere that was conducive for receiving dreams from Asclepius. And then they would either interpret it directly because it would be so clear, or temple interpreters would help people understand what the dream was bringing about. And if you like, we can talk about this sort of thing, dream incubation, ways to work with the mind as a way to cultivate guidance, insight overtly through dream incubation, which goes back thousands of years in multiple traditions. But what really interestingly happened with the advent of the Dark Ages and some not so gracious church fathers started to demonize the dream. And we're essentially evicted, my languaging, we're eventually thrown out of the temple of sleep. And so I'm drafting a particular book, the third in my trilogy now, called The Lost Temple of Sleep, Integral Dream Yoga and the Path of Awakening, which is a way that we can each individually in our own way do our own temple reconstruction project every night when we go to sleep. And these sleep hygiene projects are part of that, to create an atmosphere of respect, honor, and even sanctity for the mind that is cultivated and eventually even released in the nocturnal arena, as a way, in fact, to engage in these types of meditations. So I'll be saying a little bit more about that later, but the idea is the more you respect your sleep, the more you respect your dreams, the more you honor your dream state. We have such a dismissive relationship to the dream state, right? We say, oh, that's just a dream. I mean, that's a pejorative comment. And so it's unfortunately indicative of the way we in the West tend to dismiss the states of consciousness that fundamentally ego cannot fully experience. This has to do with a type of hubris, a type of wake centricity that ego, this particular level of development, has towards states of consciousness it can't fully experience, like sleep and dream. And so I'll talk in a minute about dream yoga, which is maintaining complete lucidity in the dream state. Sleep yoga, as unbelievable as it may appear, I'll mention more about this in a bit, maintaining complete lucidity in the deep dreamless state. Well, one of the biggest reasons that we in the West don't have access to these refined states of consciousness, which by the way, in Eastern philosophical traditions, these are causative states of awareness, consciousness. This is where reality actually arises from in Eastern philosophical traditions. So in a very real way, the West has it completely backwards. This kind of wake centricity that the only way we can explore mind, meditate, the only way we can know reality is through the waking state. Who says? Aristotle? The Greeks? And so Eastern philosophy, Eastern spiritual traditions draw on all three states, waking, dreaming, and deep dreamless sleep, to understand the nature of mind and reality. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a survey of why this may be of some interest to us. And so in order to finish my little riff on this, very brief Eastern sleep hygiene practices. One is, what a surprise, do some meditation, do some unwinding before you go to sleep. Because in the inner yogic traditions, in Tibetan yoga, my principal tradition, Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, they work a great deal with inner yogas. Just like there are outer body yogas that work with the outer body, there's a vast array of inner subtle body yogas that work with the subtle body. And the reason I mention this is that dream yoga and sleep yoga are subtle body yogas. And so as we go to sleep every night, in fact, one of the things that actually brings about insomnia is in fact the inability to unwind, or in yogic language, unwind. The winds, the chi, the prana, the lung, just gets too elevated. There's too much wind stuck in the head center. And so when we fall asleep, whether we know it or not, according to inner yogic traditions, we literally unwind, unwind. And so two ways to work with this. One is just good old over-the-counter mindfulness meditation before you go to sleep. I do this religiously. This is part of my sleep hygiene practice. At least 15 minutes, usually more like half an hour or 45 minutes, every night before I go to sleep. I do standard mindfulness meditation, and then a few of the other little practices I'll show you if you are in fact interested in exploring these nocturnal practices. The other thing you can do, and this also really helps with insomnia, by the way, as an inner yogic trick, is a form of pranayama, or it's called in the Tibetan tradition, expelling the stale air, stale winds. And this could not be simpler. You take your hands, you put them in this posture, thumb at the base of the ring finger, close your hands over your thumb. That is a subtle, nuanced inner yogic potential to close the particular meridians or channels that are associated with discursiveness. You take 3 very slow, deep in-breaths, very slow, deep, and then final forceful exhalation, out-breath. And basically with a sense that not only are you expelling all the stale wind through your lungs, but there's a sense that you're expelling all the stale prana, the lung, the chi, from all the channel systems in your body. And I toss this out just for people who have resonance with these sorts of things, yoga practitioners and the like. You're probably already doing something like this. But you do it 3 times, visualizing, if you're interested in augmenting it, visualizing all the energetics associated with aggression being expelled. 3 more times, dispelling all the energetics and the winds associated with grasping. And then 3 more times, expelling the winds associated with indifference or ignorance. And again, I simply recommend, if you suffer from insomnia, either onset insomnia, having trouble going to sleep, or maintenance insomnia. You wake up in the middle of the night, you can't go back to sleep. Try this thing. Just see how it works to decelerate, to unwind the mind. It's very interesting in tantric languaging, thought is literally referred to as movement of mind. And that movement is in fact driven by these winds. So these are just some ways that I have both worked in my own experience very directly and teaching this stuff for decades that has been profoundly effective for me.